Welcome to this webinar, Sustainability and Competition Law. To start, we have Felipe Irarrázaval, who is our director from Centro Competencia, CeCo, and he is going to speak some brief words. So go ahead, Felipe.
Thank you, Tamara. It will be just a couple of minutes. Don't be afraid. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first event jointly hosted by CeCo and ASCOLA Latin American chapter. At CeCo, we strongly value the dissemination of academic work and the effort to make high levels ideas accessible to a broader audience. Today, we are very glad to host what should be a lively discussion on the intersection between competition law and environmental sustainability. In recent years, antitrust has gone through important changes. We have been rethinking its goal and how it should relate to broader public policy. One of the key questions today is whether and how antitrust should incorporate, for example, environmental concerns and other public policy. I hope this discussion helps deepen this debate and clarify what is at stake. That said, I would like to briefly raise a few concerns. These relate to practical challenges in the application of competition law. If we open the door to public interest values beyond total welfare and efficiency, which goals should we choose or prioritize? There are many possible objectives, and they may conflict with each other: employment, environmental protection, gender, media pluralism, etc., etc. If we include social goals beyond consumer and producer welfare, how should they be weighted? Do we have reliable tools to access their effects in a consistent way? Can we compare them meaningfully? Can these goals be incorporated without a legal reform that explicitly allows it? Do competition authorities have the democratic legitimacy to consider environmental effects? And if they do, how can this role be reconciled with the mandates of environmental agencies? To address these questions and other issues, we are joined by an outstanding panel. I would like to thank ASCOLA's Latin American chapter, especially Juan David Gutierrez and Macarena Viertel, for their invaluable support in organizing this event and coordinating with our speakers, and also to Tamara Sandoval, from CeCo. We hope this seminar will be the first of many that we will organize in the future with ASCOLA, and we believe it is important to build bridges between academics and practitioners, as well as consultants working in competition law and economics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And now we pass to Juan David Gutierrez. Go ahead, Juan David.
Well, good morning and good afternoon and even good evening for people all over the world who are watching us, who are part of this. I'm very happy that we were able to organize this. As Felipe and Tamara explained before, this is a CeCo and ASCOLA Latin American chapter event. For those of you who are not acquainted with ASCOLA, ASCOLA is the Academic Society for Competition Law. It was founded over 2 decades ago in Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. Since then, it expanded not just in Europe, but also beyond. Now, there are hundreds of scholars from all continents in ASCOLA, and we have an annual conference. This year, it will be the 20th, that will take place in London. It's a very competitive conference in the sense that you have to submit a paper and pass through peer review to be able to present, but otherwise you are always invited to attend. I think tickets are already gone, so maybe not this conference, but next conference you are very invited to participate, both submitting papers and if not, then just requesting a ticket for being part of the audience. And both Macarena Vierter and I are in charge of the Latin American chapter. We, of course, mostly organize things via online activities. This is one of these activities, but this is a very special activity because we normally do not organize activities jointly with universities, something that we should probably do more. And in this sense, I join Felipe's words in the sense that I hope that we can carry on organizing more things together. And of course, I also join Felipe thanking Macarena and thanking his team for organizing this event and setting up this great lineup of speakers. Now, I think that Felipe introduced the topic and concerns. I could also give a few words about it. I do think there is a discussion about whether public interests should be considered in the enforcement of competition law. However, regarding the sustainable agenda, I think there's also other debates. For example, when does competition law, by following its regular or traditional objectives, contributes to sustainable goals? Something that has been termed using competition law as a sword for advancing sustainability objectives. But then there's the opposite side, the other side of the moon, let's call it, the dark side of the moon of competition law. And it's when competition law may prevent activities that would further sustainability. And then a valid question would be whether competition law has in each jurisdiction flexibility to allow for certain agreements, let's say, or certain practices that would be very positive and significant from the point of view of sustainability, but that could be considered potentially an infringement to competition law, whether competition law has some sort of exception, if there's some sort of shield against it. So I've used now a paradigm that's very common in the literature on antitrust and sustainability, which is the sword and shield paradigm, which probably our colleagues will use later on. In Latin America, we have several cases for both of it. We will have, maybe Tamara may explain this later, but later on, CeCo will publish a special issue on antitrust and sustainability. It's going to be short articles in the form of blog posts, mostly written by the speakers who join us today. And we have a varied assessment of the topic, but the one that concerns my authorship includes a mapping of different cases in Brazil, in Colombia, in Argentina, where in some cases competition law has clearly furthered sustainability objectives, and in some cases it seems that it may have prevented or may have put at risks sustainability activities. So this topic, although I guess that was especially trendy in Europe, let's say in the last almost decade, it also takes place in Latin America. It's not just something that people somewhere else are discussing, but it has implications for Latin America, of course, because also Latin America has a lot of sustainability policy issues. So with that, I don't want to advance things that will be discussed today, but I do believe that democracies have the opportunity of deciding their policies, and as much as harmonization may be a legitimate objective in policy, and in this case in competition law enforcement, we may have to live with the idea that there are different ways of approaching to the concerns that Felipe has raised and some of that I have raised, and and that probably is something that may arise today in the conversation. So again, thank you very much, everyone. Tamara, I give you the floor, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Felipe and Juan David. So before we move into our first round of questions, allow me to briefly introduce our panelists. First, Danieli Eduarda de Oliveira. Danieli holds an LLM in Law and Development from the Getulio Vargas Foundation Law School, and currently is a researcher at the Research Center of Competition, Public Policy, Innovation and Technology in Brazil. Marius Jacobides. Marius holds a PhD in competition law from Uppsala University, where he is currently serves as associate professor and senior lecturer in European law. He also serves as expert advisor on competition law and sustainability at the Hellenic Competition Commission. Then we have Benedict Schmal, who is an associated researcher at the Economic Theory Group at Ilmenau University of Technology. He holds a PhD in competition economics in Heinrich Heine University. Julian Nowak, who will join us, I think he's already joined us. He holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and is currently associate professor at the University of Hong Kong and Lund University in Sweden. He's also associate at the Oxford Center for Competition Law and Policy. Last, we have Macarena Viertel. Macarena has an LLM in Business, Competition and Regulatory Law at Freie Universität Berlin, and currently is a research fellow and doctoral candidate in the DFG graduate program, Dynamic Integration at Humboldt University of Berlin since October 2025. And last but not least, Cristóbal Lema. He holds a master in economic analysis from the University of Chile and an LLM in competition law from King's College London. He is a professor of economic law at the University of Santiago de Chile and senior associate at Ferrada Neme. So, with those introductions made, let's open our dialogue. But first, I want to set some rules. We will have a space for questions from the audience by the end of our conversation. I invite participants to use the Q&A function, and we will select and read your questions later. This dialogue will be structured in 3 topics in which I will make questions to our panelists, and they will have to answer in max 5 minutes. We now turn to the opening framing of our discussion. So the intersection between competition law and sustainability has been characterized by scholars such Holmes and Nowak through the sword and shield metaphor. The shield refers to invoking sustainability as a defense to protect potentially anti-competitive agreements from antitrust enforcement. By the other hand, the sword refers to using competition law offensively to attack conduct that is harmful to sustainability. So to open this dialogue, we would like to each of our panelists, to briefly identify which of these 2 uses best characterizes the situation in your country, offering one representative example. So let's start with Danieli.
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here discussing such interesting topic with all of you. It's an honor and a significant responsibility to share the floor with so many respected academics and to serve as a voice for the Brazilian experience. So I hope I do my role well. And just to clarify, I'm sitting in front of a window, so sometimes the sun's quite bright, and I hope you can see me okay. About the question. In Brazil, I don't see much of the sword discussion, antitrust policy being active on combating harmful actions to sustainability. It seems rather a very distant discussion, at least right now. Most discussions have been around the shield aspects, when sustainability agreements or sustainability initiatives confront with the antitrust rules. And even with various jurisdictions and policy papers around the world discussing and even implementing exceptions or guidelines, there is still some institutional resistance in Brazil. In Brazil, we don't have such exceptionalities in your law. So it's a very hot topic. And for instance, in a merger about a joint venture about operating a software to recognize some measurements about sustainability, we had the Tribunal of CADE, which is our competition authority, acknowledging the discussion that other jurisdictions have, but having a more agnostic view of it, that, well, whether competition law is or not, having to analyze this kind of issues. We don't know. We're just making sure that this specific agreement is having an antitrust protocol, and that's it. So that's where the discussion is right now in Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniele. Let's go to Marius. Go ahead, Marius.
Sure, thank you. As a clarification, I guess when you asked about our country, I will be speaking about the European Union mostly during the whole intervention, I think. But yeah, just like Daniela was saying, I think the same in the EU. We have had mostly, I mean, most of the emphasis has been on competition law as a shield. And there has been a lot of effort and a lot of work done on that aspect, much less on using it as a sword. But there are cases that can sort of be understood in that way. Julian actually has a recent chapter on that in a book with Thomas Cheng, and talks about some of these examples. One of them would be the car cartel, the diesel, and where we had basically horizontal agreement where companies lied about the emissions of their different car models. And there we see a clear overlap, you know, where you can use competition law as a sword also to come or to attack, let's say, a behavior which leads to environmental harm. So there are a few examples, but I would say mostly the effort has been on the sword side. We see, for instance, all the excellent work done actually on Article 1013, the guidelines on horizontal agreements, where we have a separate chapter now on sustainability agreements. It's quite detailed. There was a lot of work done on that.
Okay, thank you, Marius. Let's move on to Benedict.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara, and thank you, everyone, for inviting me and having me here. Right at the beginning, I want to just briefly state that, like, all views and opinions are personally my own. And that being said, Marius already basically stole my opening statement, because I'm based in Ilmenau, Germany, at Ilmenau University of Technology, and I mean, in the European Union, as you said, we have the EC horizontal cooperation guidelines with the sustainability chapter, and I also wanted to refer to the diesel cartel between Mercedes, Volkswagen, and BMW, where we could actually see, and I think that leads a little bit to the next section without spoiling anything, is that we can see that the sword can be, I think, quite effective to protect the environment or to fight environmental harm. And so, I mean, the thing I would like to defend here today is that I think rivalry and competition is sustainability's ally, and coordination is the threat. And the diesel cartel is one example for that. And therefore, I would argue that we should be far more comfortable with the sword than with the shield, in my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Benedict. Let's go with Macarena or Cristobal.
Yeah, I think I will start. Thanks to the Latin America chapter of ASCOLA and to CeCo for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. On Chile, we don't have that much of cases, but I think the sword metaphor has had some traction in a few cases in the past. It's not a main topic in the discussion, but environmental consideration has functioned as an aggravating factor in a few cases, not a standalone dimension of competitive harm, but reinforcing actually the conclusion already reached on the traditional approach. So, for example, we have the lead batteries case, so baterías de plomo in Spanish, where the FNE linked the environmental externalities, the negative externalities, to consumer harm as an element of a potential buyer power abuse, and it ended up recommending some regulatory modifications in that case. And that is a relatively old case of 2017, so it's even before sustainability and competition law came back as a hot topic internationally, even though I know that Julian and others such as Susan Kingston have written about this like for 20 years. And also we have in the fire cartel cases in which the competition court, following some of the precedent of the Supreme Court, stated specifically that this kind of sustainability harm to the environment could be an aggravating factor in a cartel. So that will lead to an increase of the fine that was actually imposed. So again, not a standalone sword issue, but functioning as an auxiliary way together with or in top of the more traditional approach of consumer harm. And I think Macarena will probably have something to add about that.
Yes, just to disclose, Cristobal and I wrote our contribution together, so we will be participating together in this webinar, but we will abide to your rules, Tamara, so don't worry about the time. I just wanted to add very quickly that in Chile, I think personally that the sword, not the shield analogy fully captures what is going on here, which is not that much. But however, and adding on what Cristobal said, I do think the authority consciously set aside the shield aspect of sustainability. And this is particularly in the context of this law, the extended producer responsibility law that we have in Chile that is called Ley Rep in Spanish, where the competition authority, the FNE, explicitly stated that environmental considerations shouldn't and cannot override competition law compliance. So I think that this is a reflection on how the authority has decided in very specific cases how to deal with this thing and how to kind of decide on whether the sword that Cristobal was mentioning before or the shield aspect of these external or different considerations that go beyond price and traditional competition law enforcement.
Okay, thank you, Macarena. We could end with you, Julian. Oh.
1 second, I muted myself and now I'm muting myself. So I don't really know what I should add, and I don't really know which jurisdiction I should add. I could say something more about the EU. I could say something about Asia. In Asia, we don't have so many cases. We have some cases here and there. You see cases, interesting cases, I think, in Australia, where they have a very sophisticated approach to look into public interest considerations when competition needs to be restricted for that purpose. So the shield kind of situation. And they have a very elaborated framework how to evaluate that. And I think that is interesting, and they have looked into environmental concerns, like there's a battery case, there's a case about social concerns, homework, like women that work from home, and whether they get paid a minimum salary. So there are some interesting cases there. I think that's something I could highlight now.
Okay, thank you, Julian. So now let's go right into our first thematic block, which involves the foundational question of this discussion. Is competition law a useful instrument for advancing sustainability goals? And in that matter, I would like to start with you, Benedict. Several of the scholars here today have argued that competition law and sustainability are compatible. But your contribution takes a more skeptical stance. You argue that the wrong tool for the right problem remains being the wrong tool, even when compatibility is shown. Could you walk us through the risks of using competition law as a sustainability instrument, and tell us whether, in your view, those risks outweigh the potential benefits?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's great to take here the opposing view, I think. And I identified more or less six concrete risks, what we have when we take sustainability into like a competition law perspective. And the first one is kind of a knowledge problem. So the competition authorities can't verify whether a given restraint, a competitive restraint, is the best route to sustainability, right? So then firms, of course, might come up and say like, well, we need to cooperate on this kind of thing here to protect the environment, so and so. But often, like the competition authorities lack the context, they lack the background, they lack the knowledge to verify, is this really the best route? And also society as a whole loses the discovery process that would have revealed better options. So, I mean, there's this idea, that's this Hayekian idea of competition as a discovery procedure, how to move forward, how to progress. And we don't know in advance which kind of technology, supply chain, or technological, ecological standard wins in the end. The second problem is, I mean, it's related to the first one, is it freezes the search. If you have horizontal coordination, this replaces the experimentation with alternatives, right? So if you have premature standardization, you have less product variety and incumbent protection. For example, if you coordinate as a group of car manufacturers to improve the combustion engines, this can entrench the status quo and crowd out disruptive EV or hydrogen paths. So what we would expect, I think, or what the risk is, that we see process innovation over disruptive innovation, because it's more difficult to as an outsider to beat such a cartel. And as an insider, of course, you stick with your colluded equilibrium of technology. The third one is, I have to keep the time on track here, but the third one is, of course, greenwashing. So sustainability might become a vocabulary to re-describe ordinary restraints. So an output restraint, maybe you relabel as a conservation, and price rises could be labeled as transition finance and stuff like this. So if you exclude someone from the supply chain, you could call it like supply chain integrity, stuff like this and that. So there are this political economy domain that actually it's actually greenwashing, or that it could be greenwashing of like just normal anti-competitive behaviors that are now labeled as sustainable. Then we have information asymmetry. That's a bit, I mean, that's similar to the first one, maybe going through my notes. But the issue is that the firms that are involved in anti-competitive behaviors, they hold the tech data, they hold the development knowledge, and they can showcase the visible immediate green benefits. But what is hidden, or what is not known at all, is the lost innovation, the lost entry, the lost price competition that would have been possible without such green horizontal agreements. Maybe the fifth one is that it lets governments off the hook. So private self-regulation becomes an excuse not to design proper environmental policy. That's also an argument that Schinkel and Truren coined in their 2021 paper. And that's an issue, I think. You just offload this issue from environmental policy to competition law. And then the question is, where do you stop, right? You could also social policy issues could be also offloaded in theory to competition law. And once you start this effort to say like, well, competition law should fix this or that problem, there is a slippery slope, right? And the very last one, as had also already been mentioned, is the democratic legitimacy. So what to price, subsidize, phase out, who pays, these kinds of technologies, these are political intergenerational trade-offs, right? These are made for policymakers, for legislatures, for members of parliament, and not necessarily for competition authorities under the procedural form of antitrust analysis. So these are my six risks I would define, which doesn't mean that there is not a single good point on sustainability and competition law, right? But I just want to phrase these six issues. And as a bottom line or as a summary, I would argue, yes, the risks outweigh the benefits.
Okay, thank you, Benedict. Now going to a quite different approach. Let's go to you, Marius. So building on that point, you argue that choosing not to incorporate sustainability into competition policy is itself an ideological choice, not a neutral one. But doesn't that argument risk opening the door to any expansion of competition agency mandates? Where, if anywhere, would you draw the line?
Thank you, Tamara, for that question. We're going to go into the maybe more details regarding implementation later on, but I think it's good to answer this question now, this more general question, let's say, which is basically at the heart of what we're discussing today. Now, this question is based a little bit on, and actually Benedict touched upon it, on a kind of slippery slope idea. If we accept sustainability, where do we stop? How much can we expand the mandates of competition authorities and so on? So I will give an immediate answer and then I will elaborate. And I think my simple answer is that we can expand the mandates of competition agencies as much as we want, as much as we democratically decide to do so. And as much, of course, as it is possible within the boundaries of our respective constitutions and other laws that define that. I don't think it's really more complicated than that. And then, of course, we can discuss about the details and look at each jurisdiction in its own right. Now, to elaborate, I think first that it's important to acknowledge that the neutrality of competition law, for me at least, seems to be a myth. My argument is that, as you said, not incorporating sustainability is itself an ideological choice. And this rests on the idea that competition law does not operate in a vacuum. The competition policy we've had in the last 30 years, in the EU at least, assumes that consumer welfare, which is often defined as low prices and output, is a sort of sole primary objective, even if we accept that there might be other sort of secondary objectives. But of course, this implicitly then favors a sort of short-term efficiency over things such as long-term societal survival, which is obviously quite important. And so by ignoring environmental externalities, regulators are then effectively choosing to prioritize immediate price stability over, let's say, intergenerational equity. This is a choice. It's not, a law of nature. So claiming neutrality is actually an endorsement of this kind of status quo, which itself has a massive political and economic consequences. The status quo is, of course, itself based on a certain ideology. It is based on a certain economic model, and nothing about that ideology and economic model is neutral. It is not, a scientific law. It is a choice, a policy choice. And my point is that we can make a different choice. We're not forever bound to neoliberalism simply because it seemed to be a good idea 50 years ago. And we're not bound to this sort of capitalism that produces billionaires while the rest of us, struggle to make ends meet. So, all right, once we accept them, then we can make a different choice and we can ask ourselves, like you did, where do we stop? Where are the outer boundaries? And I see that concern of slippery slope as quite valid, of course. And we see already, indeed, in the second Trump administration, how antitrust is operationalized or used to, further the administration's anti-woke capitalism agenda. But my point is that, the possibility of abusing a tool to do something bad doesn't mean that while we can use it also to do good things, doesn't mean that we don't use the tool. Just because you can use a knife to murder someone doesn't mean that we don't allow knives in the kitchen to cut stuff. Instead, we put safeguards, we put deterrents, we put, we work on prevention and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, we can take into account sustainability in the broad sense. We can cover climate change issues, income inequality, competitiveness, democracy, national security, without having to accept everything as a goal of competition law. And when it comes to the boundaries, a few ideas. One could be, focusing on market failures, or even more important, systemic market failures. Climate change is clear now. Here, the science is clear. We can measure the externality. Labor price too low, perhaps, would be another one that we could take into account. So in this case, competition agencies would intervene primarily when markets fail to allocate resources efficiently, and where we have unpriced externalities. Second, we can find the boundaries in the law itself, and this, of course, will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. A clear example here is South Africa, where the competition rules, in their competition rules, they're instructed to take into account racial economic inequality and also past injustices. That is the law there, and it works just fine. And the arguments I made in my written opinion piece for you are, of course, about EU competition law. So I do not claim that they're valid in every jurisdiction, but for the EU, the antitrust rules are part of the EU's primary law. They're part of the treaties and the Union's economic constitution. These treaties tell the European Union what Europeans, as indirect constituent power through their member states, want the EU to do, right? And this is democratic. They have democratically decided what the EU should be doing. And we find this in Article 2 of the TEU. We found it in Article 3 of the TEU. So those clearly put boundaries on what can be taken into account. And here the mandate is quite clear, to promote, for instance, sustainable development, a social market economy, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we can have more direct boundaries given through cycles of elections, right? We vote and we get our politicians and they decide policy, and then that can be then what frames the outer boundaries of what competition policy can be used to pursue. I think I'll leave it to that for now.
Okay, thank you, Marius. Now let's go to Latin America. And I would like to start with Macarena or Cristobal. So in her article, Danielle has argued that CADE's failure to articulate a framework for sustainability agreements is not a neutral stance. It effectively reinforced an orthodox approach that leaves no room for environmental considerations. Does that argument resonate with the Chilean context?
Thank you, Tamara. I will take this. I really enjoyed reading Daniele's text, so looking forward to it to be published so everyone can read it. Because despite the fact that we are in the same region, there are some differences. So there's not an easy answer for your question. I would say that yes, this idea resonates in the Chilean context, but there are, to some extent, but there are some important caveats that I should mention. The first one, and I think this is an important difference, is that in Chile, we don't have any specific framework for sustainability agreements, mergers, or the like. So already this reinforces the traditional application of competition law, right? But even, and this is what we argue with Cristobal in our text, even under that setting, we find some spaces where the competition authority can actually include green considerations. So for example, it can be considered as a competitive factor that can influence market definition in merger cases, for example, but it can also be considered, and probably we will later develop on this, sustainability can also be considered as a part of a theory of harm. So there is this possibility within Chilean competition law. The second caveat is that we don't have, and I think this is different from the EU, but also from Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have a framework for cooperation agreements between competitors. So what happens here is that any competitors that would like to make an agreement with this specific goal will face no guidance from the authority, right? And then this agreement will be analyzed under the strict rules of the Chilean competition law. So it will have to navigate the general prohibition of anti-competitive conduct that is in our competition law. And this, of course, creates uncertainty, which, in my personal opinion, is what also affects companies and other actors engaging in the sustainability considerations, right? There are, and I will end with this, the authority has mentioned for the past several years that they want to provide a guidance on this sort of agreements. But now, given to the budget constraints that the authority is currently facing, I think it's reasonable too, they don't have this guidance as its top priorities for the coming term.
Yes. Thank you, Macarena. Let's go on to our second block about green cooperation agreements. So from the foundational question of whether antitrust is the right tool, we now move to a more operational challenge. When competitors cooperate around a shared environmental objective, when does that cross the line into a cartel territory? This is the focus of our second block, and I would like to start with you, Daniele. So, the soy moratorium in Brazil was treated by CADE as a potential buyer's cartel with little engagement with its environmental dimensions. So, in your view, what analytical framework should CADE have applied to assess whether the arrangement was a legitimate sustainability agreement or a disguised anti-competitive restriction?
Well, just to clarify to Macarena, we also do not have any guidance for competitors' collaboration in Brazil as well. So it gives this kind of uncertainty to those having this kind of initiatives. And we have had some merger review on some of these agreements. And what CADE has been saying is that it should, well, these initiatives should have an antitrust protocol to guarantee that no sensitive information is shared. But I think that the San Ontario case specifically presents us with a very complex arrangement that it should be analyzed beyond the simple per se rule or classified as a hardcore buyer's cartel. As the commissioners themselves mentioned in the judgment of some abuse against the interim measure imposed by the general superintendents, there was lots to consider about it. For instance, the participation of public bodies, the transparency of this agreement, its publicity in the past almost 20 years, and the studies that link effectiveness of the agreement to reducing public bodies, even public documents that mention the agreement as a form of public policy that inspired other initiatives, public-led initiatives, such as the Protocol for Grains in the Pará state in Brazil, that counts with a very similar structure as a soy moratorium, but it's led by a public authority in that specific state. So even though I understand that the agreement could have some margin squeeze against the national producers, and it seems to me more about the governance aspect of the agreement than a percent competitive case. And maybe it should have an antitrust protocol. So maybe CADE should have analyzing it by the rule of reason, for instance, to consider this kind of efficiency, to consider the specificity of this arrangement that also counts with public bodies. So there some commissioners in the judgment of the appeals against the interim measures, because the general superintendents, it is kind of the first instance at CADE. It's an investigative arm and imposed an interim measure that was revised by the tribunal, which is the second instance of CADE's authority. So we have this kind of discussion within the tribunal if we should have imposed an interim measure against the so complex agreements. So I think the soil moratorium demands a framework that moves beyond the traditional simplistic cartel analysis and embrace the rule of reason that weights agreements' significant environmental benefits against potential competitive harms. And I think it also takes from the discussion about the out-of-market efficiencies, or it should be just the consumers in this soy sector specificities. And actually, I would just quickly advertise a study that we recently made within Competencia, which is the Research Center for Competition Policy at FGV Law School in Brazil. And we had the pleasure of Professor Novak have taken a look at it. And we discussed how some considerations should be made about this kind of agreements. It's a study about market power, global supply chains, environmental considerations, and how competition authorities should be taking into consideration some horizontal or vertical dimensions of those kinds of agreements. So just to summarize, I think it should be revised maybe by the rule of reason, and to ensure that the CADE's actions remain proportionate. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Daniele. Yes, I think it's a very interesting case and gives too much to think about how to implement green agreements. Let's move now to Benedict. So, Benedict, the European detergent cartel and the German car manufacturers case illustrate how environmental language can serve as a cover for anti-competitive conduct. How does a competition authority determine that an anti-competitive purpose predominates over a genuine sustainability objective? Could you point to a case that, in your opinion, clearly involved a disguised cartel?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, and quite honestly, it's hard to determine, right? So it's hard to determine, and I think that difficulty is itself the argument, at least for me, right? So if the green story is too hard to verify, that's a reason to treat the arrangement as an ordinary restraint and not to wave it through. So it's so difficult to distinguish green and, I don't know, gray cartels, whatever you want to call it, or like plain vanilla cartels. It's tricky, and that's, I think, the problem is really, where do you draw the line? And so I think there are a few questions you can ask, but that's not definite, and that's not like complete. First thing is the indispensability. So is coordination truly necessary, or could a firm move first unilaterally? So if consumers would reward the green attribute, for example, a greener detergent, or I don't know, a car that has lower emissions, then no agreement is needed. And if so, then coordination is suspicious. So this question of indispensability should be asked by competition authorities, especially, as we know, especially in the European Union, but also I think in all parts of the world, there are many consumers that want to fight and want to combat climate change, and they are willing to pay for it. So there is a favor for green products, or products with like green attributes. Of course, only to a certain extent. It varies across countries, it varies across time, it varies across groups within society, but there is some a favor, and there is certainly an attention and awareness of climate change, and that we have to tackle that. And therefore, this question of indispensability is crucial, I think. Second question is that a competition authority could ask is does it touch the hardcore variables? So I would argue, of course, that's a claim, I know that, but sustainability rarely requires price fixing, limiting output, or allocating markets or customers, right? Like the usual textbook issues of a cartel. you do not need that for sustainability reasons. So if it does, that's clearly a red flag that should alert the competition authority. Third point is openness and non-discrimination. So a genuine arrangement that really is targeting sustainability issues only, such an agreement should be open to entrants and should be transparent, right? Because this is a good cause and it should be easy for other competitors to join. If they also want to produce, to stick to the detergent case, a greener detergent, that's right. Why should the group of already like cooperating firms restrict that? In contrast, like a traditional cartel, a hardcore cartel, is designed by insiders for insiders. So a competition authority should ask who participates, who's excluded, why are these firms excluded or not participating, who monitors and who bears the costs. So if there is a reason, and this is not just like because like some firms decide on purpose to not participate in, I don't know, sustainable activities, this should be at least some kind of an indicator that something is going right or wrong. Fourth point is that there are concrete, verifiable, and causally linked benefits that can be gained from such a sustainability agreement versus some kind of vague green rhetoric, right? If you have these vague green rhetoric, that's, I guess, rather greenwashing or something to cover up a true hardcore cartel. And therefore, like the benefit, the outcome should be clear, right? Like reduced emissions by a certain percentage or whatever. And the last one is the genesis of this, the genesis and the drift of such an agreement. So the question is, did it start green and stay green, so to say, or did the cooperation grow over time and slided slowly into price or quantity coordination or market coordination? I mean, the hardcore issues. So monitoring this over time, like bring this intertemporal condition into it, I think is crucial. So did I think five dimensions? So indispensability, does it touch hardcore variables? Openness to competitors, concrete and verifiable outcomes, and the genesis over time. I think these 5 issues should be monitored by competition authorities closely to detect an anti-competitive purpose within a green, sustainable, not cartel, but agreement, whatever. But again, and then that's something I want to like wrap up a bit, is it's hard to determine, and this is like that's the feature of the problem, right? Or that's at the core of the problem, because it's hard to determine. It's a reason to treat the arrangement as an ordinary cartel itself, I think, and that's and it's better to be safe than sorry, in my view, and to like better to like be too strict there instead of like missing on a what turns out to be a hardcore cartel in hindsight. And yeah, is there a disguised cartel example? I mean, I looked it up and I put this in my blog post, the consumer detergent cartel from the European Commission in 2011. I don't recall the full years, but for several years, major detergent producers, like for consumer detergent to wash your laundry, they started as a bona fide industry environmental initiative to reduce packaging, reduce lower rate and volume, to have like more concentrated detergents, be more environmental friendly. Also, like, I'm not a chemist, but you know what you insert in there, like these tensides and stuff to clean the laundry. Actually, this mutated slowly into a price fixing cartel, and I think that's a textbook case of a green initiative that got like captured or turned dark, so to say. So I would say to now finish my part again in this blog, we do not need a new sustainability balancing to catch these green arrangements. The existing toolkit, like object restrictions, indispensability, hardcore screens, already does it. The lesson is rather to apply those screens more rigorously and not to relax them once some firms declare themselves as like cooperating in a green, sustainable dimension.
Okay, thank you, Benedict. Now let's go to Marius. The EU guidelines require that sustainability agreements pass a fair share of benefits to consumers, a condition that you criticize as still tied to the logic of individual consumer welfare. You already talked a little about this topic, but what alternative standard would you propose to evaluating potentially anti-competitive sustainability conduct?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's great to take here the opposing view. I think.
Oh,
And
I think the
I
playback is on, or is it just me hearing it? Okay, there we go. Just to begin, I would just say that I agree with Benedict on being like restrictive when it comes to the shield. So no issues there. I think, absolutely. But I think once we get to the point where we accept that there is a shield, then we also need to talk seriously about the sword. Now, coming to the issue of the passing on to consumers that you asked about sorry. I was part of the team of the Hellenic Competition Commission that gave input to the Commission on the guidelines. And I must say that this pass on to consumers condition was one of the most controversial ones, and we had a lot of debates about it. And the controversy, of course, boiled down to the question of whose sustainability benefits should be taken into account as efficiency gains towards an efficiency defense. So in the end, the Commission here opted for distinguishing between three types of sustainability benefits. So first, we have the benefits of individual use value, as they call them, which are sustainability benefits that individually fall basically on the same consumers as the ones who suffer the harm. And they pose no difficulties and normally satisfy the condition. Then we have the second category, benefits of individual non-use value, which are indirect benefits that result from consumers' appreciation of how their sustainable consumption positively affects others, including non-users of the products. And these then are treated the same way as the individual use value benefits, as consumers in the relevant market that suffer the anti-competitive harm may have the willingness to pay for the benefit to other individuals. So, for instance, society at large, future generations, and so on. And then we have these collective benefits that you mentioned. And here we have benefits that arise independently of consumers' individual appreciation of the product. And they may accrue to a larger group in society than just consumers on the relevant market, even if consumers do not have willingness to pay. So here, the Commission only accepts that the fair share criterion is satisfied in situations where consumers in the relevant market substantially basically overlap with or form part of the group of beneficiaries outside of the relevant market, so that the collective benefit to consumers in the relevant market that occurs outside the market is significant enough to compensate consumers in the relevant market for the harm that they suffer on account of the reduction in competition. So just to clarify, I take mostly issue with this third category. And I'll just give you quickly an example used by the Commission itself to appreciate the reason. So the Commission's example regards consumers who might consider buying, let's say, clothing made of sustainable cotton that reduces the use of fertilizers and water on the land where the cotton is cultivated. So the Commission accepts that these environmental benefits could in principle be considered as collective benefits, but they say here the benefit would not fall on the same persons as the ones buying the goods, because it's not the same category as the ones growing the cotton or living close to where the cotton is grown. So here the benefit would be considered for an Article 101(3) exception only to the extent that the buyers of the more sustainable clothing would be willing to pay more for the sustainability benefit. So imagine, for instance, that there's a benefit somewhere in India, but we're looking at European consumers. The garments become 30% more expensive on account of this, and Europeans are not willing to pay 30% more for the sustainable garment. The sustainability benefit here basically fails. I think, in my opinion, this kind of distinction between collective benefits and individual non-use benefits shouldn't really have been made. And mostly, I don't think we can really use a willingness to pay test here. We could use other evidence, we could use broader evidence to decide whether this claimed efficiency is enough to counteract the anti-competitive effect. I think actually that willingness to pay here is quite misleading and actually a little bit cruel or ridiculous as a test. In the sense you're asking, a competition agency or a court would be asking, are consumers in the relevant market prepared to pay 30% more or 30 cents extra, let's say, more per unit to ensure slavery is not used in the production of a t-shirt? What kind of question is that, what inference are we supposed to make from a negative answer to that? Does it mean that people don't care about slavery? I hope not. But of course, people don't have infinite resources. They might not be able to pay for the extra and so on. Do we then have to disregard the benefit? I don't think so. So instead, I think we can look at broader evidence, surveys, for instance. We can make value judgments. Lawyers do that all the time. Judges do that all the time. We can balance different principles against each other. We can do balancing act, which is not econometric. Like this is the bread and butter of lawyers. It doesn't have to be, putting numbers to be able to make a balancing. You can balance in different ways. So I think that was mostly my point with regard to the passing on criterion.
Okay, thank you, Marius. Now, going to Cristobal and Macarena, I would like to ask you about one topic that you already mentioned, Chile's Extended Producer Responsibility Law, or Ley REP. That law requires competing producers to cooperate through collective waste management systems to achieve an environmental objective. The TDLC, which is the competition tribunal here in Chile, has reviewed several of these systems, applying a notably more differential standard than the FNE, which is the prosecutor. So, in your opinion, does the Ley REP experience offer a workable model for distinguishing legitimate green cooperation from anti-competitive coordination?
Thanks for the question, Tamara. And for full disclosure, I represented the companies of two of the systems that submitted their cooperation before the competition court. But the views I'm saying are my own. First, I think the Ley REP experience is actually instructive, but I will be cautious about reading as a fully workable model for other types of cooperations. It does show that Chilean institutional framework is capable of applying a more differential standard, as you mentioned, and that's my view. The competition court was more differential about the rules, proceedings, and tendering rules the companies were agreeing than the FNE, and that led to the court allowing some stuff that maybe the FNE, the competition authority, was against. So we have a specific regulatory framework with explicit sustainability objectives. So in that sense, it's kind of a proof of concept. Sustainability-driven cooperation in Chile can be assessed with greater nuance than using the full prohibition of Article 3 of Chilean competition law, Decreto Ley 211. But I think there are reasons to be cautious about generalizing from this experience. The Ley REP model works because the legislator, the Congress, decided that it was important to have this kind of joint initiatives, or that at least allowing the companies to have these collective systems to enhance recycling in Chile. So as mentioned by Marius, there was a systemic problem of under-recycling in Chile, and that was addressed by a law that allowed competitors to cooperate to achieve this goal. Even in that context, the FNE and the competition court reviews was mostly focused on limiting the risk and harms of the bylaws of the systems and of the tender, procedures because they will have buying power. But there were limited discussions about actually the environmental benefits associated with the collective system. So these were mostly assured by the existing law and the obligation imposed on the companies, and not strictly speaking, perhaps from the collective cooperation between competitors and providers and clients in some cases. So the honest answer, at least we think, it's that the lay rep, it's an experience that opens a door in Chile, but it doesn't build a fully functioning framework that could be used to walk through any other type of cooperation in Chile.
Okay, thank you, Cristobal. So we have explored the foundational question, then the question of cooperative agreements. So let's now move to another arena, merger control. How, if at all, should sustainability factor into merger analysis? So I want to stay with you, Cristobal or Macarena, and ask you, your work identifies spaces within the current Chilean system for incorporating sustainability without the need of legal reform. Which of these seems most viable to you? Additional competitive variables beyond price, theories of harm linked to consumer welfare, or any another approach entirely?
Thanks. I will respond part of this, and then I think Macarena will probably have something to add. I'm not sure if it's in itself the most promising, but at least there's a space in which the Chilean system is a bit more flexible than the European one, is that Chilean Competition Court in the Ideal Nutrabien merger case explicitly stated that all efficiencies inherent to transactions must be weighed in, regardless of whether these relate to harmed or affected relevant markets. So that contrasts a lot with the European general principle that the harms and the benefits should be assessed in the same markets, so you cannot balance out between benefits to one consumers against harms to other consumers. So that, I think, opens a door for relevant green efficiencies, because as Marius was mentioning, some sustainability, environmental or perhaps broader sustainability like labor rights, are not generally materialized in the same country or region or market. So insofar as you have benefits to Chilean consumers, if you can put it out in that general concept, the Chilean Competition Court standard will say, yes, you have to take those in consideration in merger cases. And the FNE actually, with some caveats, some nuances, already incorporated that into its merger guidelines. So that's an aspect in which Chilean perhaps is more flexible than the European Union. Despite that openness, two things to highlight is that such standard of the Competition Court has not validated by the Supreme Court. So let's see if it ever comes to that in the Supreme Court. And also, to be fair, in our knowledge, there hasn't been any merger case or antitrust in general case in which sustainability benefits has been assessed in Chile. So it's a theoretic possibility, but yet to be analyzed or seen in a specific case.
I will just add on that very briefly, because when we're discussing this, well, this happens when you write with someone, right? You have different opinions sometimes, and Cristobal just ended up saying, yeah, this is like theoretically, this should be possible. But then I remember we discussed, okay, but what is real actually? What has the authority already done that we can say, okay, then there's this space for sustainability. And specifically in merger control, the authority already incorporated some parameters that are beyond price. In our text, we describe with these cases. So from that perspective, we don't see any issue for a future case where sustainability will be a parameter of competition, that it will be also considered in the competitive assessment. Also, regarding, for example, and these are already cases that we mentioned, the Baterías del Plomo case and also the Carteles del Fuego case. These are not merger control cases, but these are two cases where the competition authorities in Chile already linked sustainability or environmental considerations into the theory of harm. So we see that these are some spaces where the authority can include these considerations, despite the fact that there is still a gap between these things happening in not merger control cases, and then being this later on realized in this other competition law arena.
Okay, thank you, Macarena. Now we go to Danieli. Danieli, in the Sustainit case, Commissioner Freitas de Lima stated that the environmental objectives are foreign to antitrust analysis. Is that position, in your opinion, viable in legal systems where the Constitution explicitly places environmental protection and competition as co-equal principles, as is the case of the Brazilian Constitution?
Well, thank you. So just for context, the Sustainability case was the merger that I mentioned. That CADE has reviewed a joint venture to make a software to standardize some sustainability measures across food supply chains. So this was the first case where CADE has been explicit about the competition and sustainability interlinked before the soil moratorium, which was the mainstream case. So in this case, the firm submitted this merger analysis to CADE to analyze if the joint venture could be done. And it's interesting because it was the first time the CADE tribunal specifically addressed this interlink between competition and environmental issues and sustainability issues. And just a disclaimer, because many authors have listed some of CADE's decisions approving or clearing some mergers that had some sustainability benefits, as CADE manifesting their opinion positively about environmental goals and etc. But I don't see it this way, because in these other mergers, mostly CADE did not talk about this sustainability gains. He just said, well, it doesn't have any antitrust issues disagreement here, so it's okay, I will clear it. So, and this Sustainability IT case, CADE did the opposite. Some of commissioners specifically addressed this interlink between competition and sustainability, but they didn't acknowledge it as a reason to prove the case. They just said, well, it is in our constitution as some of the objectives that our economic rules should pursue, the environmental preservation, some social considerations alongside with free enterprises. It has been a very thoughtful discussion around the world between the interlink between sustainability and competition, and that's it. We'll face it someday, but by now we're just saying that this merger here doesn't have any antitrust preoccupations, and specifically because it has an antitrust protocol. And because of that, a commissioner wrote an award-winning commentary saying that CADE has an agnostic view about environmental goals and competition. So I don't think it's agnostic. I think CADE is not considering it, but it's considering to discuss this someday, which has not happened yet. And I think it will be for someday, because as in the EU, we have in our constitution as objectives of our economic order to be pursued environmental considerations, social considerations alongside competition. So I don't think it's sustainable to maintain a strict view and just ignore sustainability concerns in merger analysis, or even in cartel analysis or conduct. I think CADE will be forced someday to confront it directly. And I think for Brazil and for the geopolitical economy, it's very important that we address these issues as with many public policies that we can to incentivize, of course, having the antitrust concerns well posed, but still offering some incentives to enterprise to collaborate and change the way they produce and to be more environmentally and socially friendly. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Daniele. I would like to go now with you both, Marius and Benedict, about your take on this topic. The latest EU draft merger guidelines explicitly recognize sustainability as a competitive parameter and introduced this concept that I think it's really great. Theory of benefits, alongside the traditional theories of harm. What is your assessment of this development? Let's start with you, Marius.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be super quick here. I think it's interesting. I like the idea of like this kind of equality. You have theories of harm, then you should have theories of benefit. It's a nice, catchy sort of way of describing it. Generally, I think it's a good development. On the positive side, I think it makes sense to align merger control more to the new approach under horizontal agreements that we were talking about before, and the approach to Article 101.3. I also like the Commission's willingness to adapt the time frame taken into consideration for the efficiencies. This is spelled out in paragraph 293 of the draft guidelines. And I think this is good because, sometimes or quite often sustainability benefits might take longer than 2 years, which is the usual time frame to materialize. So I think generally it's a good development. But of course, there must be strong safeguards against greenwashing, and the claims that the companies make must be substantiated and merger specific and so on. I don't really think this is going to be a problem, knowing from practice how high a hurdle it has so far been usually to prove efficiencies in mergers. So obviously we'll have to wait and see, but I don't think it's going to be, I don't think too many mergers will be escaping, let's say, simply because they claim some kind of sustainability benefit.
Of course, I agree. Let's go with you, Benedict.
Yeah, thank you. And I can fully agree with Marius that like the theory of benefit, that's a nice and like, I don't know, it's a cool idea, and it's a cool approach. Even though like, let me still play a little bit of devil's advocate, I still think that this concept of theory of benefit, especially the dynamic perspective over time, is a bit of it's again a knowledge question in the sense that how do we know, or how does the Commission can verify future green benefits over a flexible time horizon? So forecasting dynamic gains is exactly what like competition is supposed to discover, and not really what an authority can predict, right? I mean, always future is always uncertain. That's not a secret, and that's a cheap critique. But the question is, to which extent can we to which extent can we predict what future will bring, and to which extent can we reliable define the theory of benefit, especially in a dynamic perspective. So that's what I like to raise as an issue. Even though I like this concept because it emphasizes again that treating sustainability as something that firms compete on is valuable, right? So it's actually green competition if it's about these sustainability issues, right? And not so much green antitrust if you take it from that perspective. So it's an interesting concept, and we should see how it evolves in the process of the guidelines, and then also later on in practice.
Thank you, Benedict. Now Before we pass to the question from the audience, I would like to turn to Professor Julian Nowak, who has mapped the intersection of competition law and sustainability. So, Julian, I have two brief questions for you. The first is, you have distinguished between excluding sustainability agreements from the scope of antitrust entirely and conducting a balancing exercise within the analysis. What is the practical difference between these two approaches, and which might better mitigate the risk of green cartel abuse while still achieving the environmental objectives? Julian, are you there?
I'm there. Sorry.
Thank you.
I always put, I think there's always one person that kind of doesn't get it right with the unmuting. This time it's me, sorry. But I think I'm just going to be a bit cheeky, and I'm going to take a bit of the long route, and I'm first going to say a bit kind of a reaction or a bit of a background before I answer your question. So what I try to do usually when I talk about sustainability and competition law, I try to think about it actually the opposite from this beautiful quote that you had from the commissioner in Brazil. Environmental objectives are foreign to antitrust analysis. My approach in thinking about this is that it's a bit of a Venn diagram. Like Venn diagrams are these diagrams that we all know of, these kind of, you have a circle on one hand and a circle on the other, and they somehow overlap. The question then is, how much do they overlap? This quote seems to suggest that they don't overlap at all, and that's, I think, the wrong outcome. They might overlap a little bit more or a little bit less depending on the jurisdiction, but it also depends on how close you look. So I was supposed to send you a contribution, and I was late. I only sent it today, and it is essentially on innovation, sustainable innovation, and trying to address that a bit from that perspective. And that also goes to this overlap. And in a certain way, it also brings me to whether competition law is the wrong tool for the right problem. Well, maybe competition law is the wrong tool, maybe not. If you think about the cartel, and I think we had it partly that agrees not to compete on sustainability, well, then in terms of our Venn diagram, maybe it is the right tool. So I think it really kind of depends, and the Venn diagram idea is really helpful, I think. So coming back to your question on exclusion versus balancing. So I think exclusion is something very important. It gets you mainly, and I think that's why competition authorities might also like it, it gets you away from the tricky question of how do you balance sustainability gains on the one hand and restrictions of competition on the other hand. Competition authorities don't like that. We academics, we like it because we can discuss it like we do here today, because it's nice, it's fun, it's controversial, but competition authorities don't really like it. So the idea of exclusion essentially means that we take a closer look at the specific context of the case, maybe a kind of effects analysis, and maybe the opposite of what Kaji has done in, or like parts of Kaji have done in the soy moratorium, which they treated as an by object restriction. So what does that imply? Well, that implies looking a bit closer, and it can, for example, take the shape of what the Commission has done in the horizontal guidelines. They established what they call a soft safe harbor for sustainability standards. They set out certain conditions that are meant to ensure that there is no harm to competition, or that the risk of harm is reduced. So ideally, kind of the spillover that the detergent cartel that we have already discussed about doesn't materialize. They have set some conditions there. And we also kind of, in general, with regard to standards, we know from the IT context that there are a lot of benefits of standards, but there are also risks. So we want to have a framework that somehow addresses the risks while letting the benefits pass. And that's what this kind of exclusion is about. So while guidance by competition authorities on how do they balance and so on is great, I think thinking more and providing more guidance on exclusion, the scope of what is within competition or what is not, what is a restriction of competition. That is really helpful. Yes.
Thank you, Julian. Another question related to that topic. You have talked about the different pathways available to competition agencies for incorporating sustainability. In your opinion, what practical difference does it make which pathway an agency chooses?
I think it's also kind of an interesting one. So it goes back to this kind of exclusion versus balancing distinction. Yes. And I think the interesting part is this distinction somehow holds across jurisdiction. So I'll give you an example. In the US, we have business review letters. They basically, you can find them from the 1997 until 2000s, and they all address certain fishing conservation cooperative agreements. And that was essentially the height of the consumer welfare approach. And what the DOJ in those letters basically said, look, if you are setting up your cooperation in this way to ensure that fish stock are maintained, then it's perfectly fine and we don't have any kind of restriction of competition. If we then look a bit more closely into balancing, it gets a bit more difficult and context specific. So think about your different jurisdictions. They all have different, for example, the status of international law is different. I don't know whether we have anyone here who is from the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is quite often referred to as a monarchist state. So as soon as the Netherlands has signed an international agreement, the international agreement becomes part of the law in that state. Well, then you have other states where the international law is signed and it first needs an act of parliament to become national law. Then there's also kind of a question depending on the constitutional arrangement where this international law sits. And then you have the constitutions. I think we mentioned the Brazilian that requires some kind of balancing between the economic, the environmental, and the social. In Colombia, you have also similar rules, and all over Latin America, you find them as well. And then you have the local competition laws. And I'll give you a couple of examples from the local competition law. We have already heard environmental and social benefits might be public interests, and South Africa has this kind of public interest focus, but I already mentioned at the beginning, Australia, which also has this kind of public benefits test, and what they basically do is they get all stakeholders involved in a process. If you say, well, I need to restrict competition to achieve these public benefits, then you need to have an open and transparent process where everyone involved, consumers, beneficiaries of this agreement, get to have their say before the Commission then makes any kind of decision. And even the draft decision is then again put out in this process. In other jurisdictions, you see it, for example, the public interest as a justification for mergers, often done by ministers, and that links it, I think, back to the question of democracy and democratic accountability. You see provisions regarding to the environment in Spain. In Germany, it's a more general one, but the ministers have also used that public interest justification for mergers. But you can then also think about economic frameworks within competition law. So think about general welfare, consumer welfare, and so on. And that kind of also depends a bit on the jurisdiction. And here in Asia, you have Singapore, which has adopted a guideline that basically changes the approach to climate change, and it's influenced also by the international law obligations that Singapore has under Paris, and its consequent adoption of what they call a one nation approach to climate change. And they basically say, look, climate change, all climate change benefits are benefiting the whole of Singapore, and all the benefits that are generated in the whole of Singapore, we're going to take into account. That's because their law is set up in a way that allows that in this regard. And the Austrians have done a similar thing. They have changed their competition law to have a specific mentioning of climate change. So that addresses certainly the argument or the question about democratic legitimacy. Whether we all like the way that this democratic legitimacy has been played out is a different question. But coming back to the narrow approach, so one was the kind of benefits, economic benefits to the whole of the society, whole of Singapore, for example. The narrow approach, the consumer welfare approach, think about the EU Commission. We have already kind of discussed it a bit. Whether in the EU the consumer welfare approach is the law of the land or not, that's a different question and it can be discussed. But the Commission in the guidelines chose its a path and said, look, we're going to focus on consumer welfare. And Marius also nicely highlighted that. They said, well, we're going to have use benefits. Those are the benefits that you're directly gaining from the use of the good. Then there are the non-use benefits, and I always tell my students here in Hong Kong, a non-use benefit is the amount of money that I'm happy to pay for the beautiful forest that is behind this university, not to be cut down, even though I never walk there and I never use it. I might still be able and want to pay some money so that it is not cut down. So the Commission also takes that into account. And then in the end, they talk about collective benefits. But what essentially they are meaning here is maybe objective benefits to the consumers of the product. So whether or not they value it and how much they value it, think about public health benefits as well. There, I think a wonderful example. You can possibly calculate how much the benefit for each consumer is if there's less pollution. And then you can say, well, they're going to live a year longer on average or whatever. That's an objective benefit for the consumers of the product, even though maybe the whole, we are now here in Hong Kong, maybe the whole of Hong Kong benefits, but certainly the benefits are also there for the consumer. So I think it really kind of is varied around the world, and you see quite interesting examples, and I think we should be having an open mind and think what we can do. And today I learned a lot of other nice examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So we now have some minutes to some questions from the audience. We have a couple questions. So let me read it. There is a question for Marius. It says, could you develop further the question on what competition law is about, if it can be expanded as much as it is democratically allowed to? It's so strange. Sorry. What prevents it from turning into another discipline? I don't know if it is clear, Marius, or you would like for me to read it again?
No, I think I understand.
Okay.
I think what prevents it from turning into another discipline is that, of course, we will always have other regulations, and to the extent we have specific regulations for, I don't know, environmental issues or social, labor laws and so on, of course, they set the parameters, but there will always be a little part of market conduct that is not regulated, either because we have new markets, new conduct, and so on and so forth. So I think we're talking about, what competition law can do in those situations. Of course, if we have regulation, then we apply the regulation, and perhaps we don't need competition law to do anything. Now, with the first question on what it should take into account, again, I think it really depends on the jurisdiction and the country and the choices made there. I might not agree with some choices, even if they're democratically made, but they are democratically made. So then, that's it. I think the limit is basically the outer limits of the law, the Constitution, or if there are specific laws of competition, whatever they say in each jurisdiction. And that's, I think, where it's interesting in the EU, because we don't really have that in antitrust. We have 2 articles in the treaty. And then, it's just practice and interpretation by the Court of Justice. That's why we in Europe are so kind of free to throw out our ideas and see what sticks and to try to push for a different understanding. But, of course, if it was a different situation and we had a very specific law that says this is what you should take into account, then we would have had to sort of keep ourselves within those boundaries. And then, in the next election, somebody could go with a platform of changing that and including something else, and we could vote for it or vote against it. I think it's that. And I think I'll just mention again the example of South Africa that also Julian mentioned. There it's explicit in their law that they have to take into account, the specific history of inequality and injustice, and they do that. It's not more complicated than that. So for the specific EU example, I think we need to find the answers in the treaties themselves, which are of the equal status to Article 101 and 102.
Okay, thank you. This is a question to anyone who would like to answer it. It says, have there been any institutional instances in which competition law authorities have weighed environmental concerns and competition law concerns in a quantitative manner? That is an interesting question. So who would like to take it?
I do.
Okay. Thank you.
I think, and it might not necessarily be very surprising. Many people of you have heard about the chicken of tomorrow case, but the chicken of tomorrow case is maybe not so much an environmental case or a case about sustainability. It's about the welfare of chicken. Welfare of chicken, if you look into Sustainable Development Goals, you will not find it there. But the case is still interesting. So what they have done there, and you can critique the specific methods that they have used there, but what they have done there is basically they asked consumers, okay, the chicken is going to have, and it was actually really sad, they are in a cage, and we're going to give them a bit more space. In fact, we're going to give them that much more space, one iPhone kind of more space. And how much would you willing to pay so that the chicken have a bit more space? And they came up with a price, and then they looked at how does this price relate to the increase that this agreement would bring about. And they said, well, the price increase is higher than what are the consumers are willing to pay, so they didn't let it go through. And yes, you can discuss how they came about to the price that the consumers came, or to the price that the agreement would raise the prices. But I think, in a sense, that it is a nice methodology to do that. And it's the first kind of, I think, real economic approach to that. And Marius nicely put it out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario. Well, that's all. We have reached the end of this webinar. I would like to give a very warm thank to our panelists, Daniele, Marius, Benedict, Julian, Macarena, and Cristobal, for such a rich and substantive discussion. And also many thanks to Felipe and Juan David for your introductions and for making this event possible. Thank you all the participants that joined us from across many, many countries in the world. Just to let you know, the recordings and the material from this webinar will be available in our newsletter next Wednesday. So it will be available in centrocompetencia.com. We will let you the link. And that's it. We hope to see you at future events organized by CeCo and ASCOLA, and have a wonderful day, and goodbye to you all.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the event.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the organization.
Thank you, everyone.